January 1976. Chapter 1. On those cloudy days, Robert Neville was never sure when sunset came, and sometimes they were in the streets before he could get back. If he had been more analytical, he might have calculated the approximate time of their arrival, but he still used the lifetime habit of judging nightfall by the sky, and on cloudy days that method didn't work. That was why he chose to stay near the house on those days. He walked around the house in the dull gray of afternoon, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, trailing thread-like smoke over his shoulder. He checked each window to see if any of the boards had been loosened. After violent attacks, the planks were often split or partially pried off, and he had to replace them completely, a job he hated. Today only one plank was loose. Isn't that amazing, he thought. In the backyard, he checked the hothouse and the water tank. Sometimes the structure around the tank might be weakened, or its rain catchers bent or broken off. Sometimes they would lob rocks over the high fence around the hothouse, and occasionally they would tear through the overhead net, and he'd have to replace panes. Both the tank and the hothouse were undamaged today. He went to the house for a hammer and nails. As he pushed open the front door, he looked at the distorted reflection of himself in the cracked mirror he'd fastened to the door a month ago. In a few days, jagged pieces of the silver-backed glass would start to fall off. Let 'em fall, he thought. It was the last damned mirror he'd put there. It wasn't worth it. He'd put garlic there instead. Garlic always worked. He passed slowly through the dim silence of the living room, turned left into the small hallway, and left again into his bedroom. Once the room had been warmly decorated, but that was in another time. Now it was a room entirely functional, and since Neville's bed and bureau took up so little space, he had converted one side of the room into a shop. A long bench covered almost an entire wall. On its hardwood top, a heavy bandsaw, a wood lathe, an emery wheel, and a vise. Above it, on the wall, were haphazard racks of the tools that Robert Neville used. He took a hammer from the bench and picked out a few nails from one of the disordered bins. Then he went back outside and nailed the plank fast to the shutter. The unused nails he threw into the rubble next door. For a while he stood on the front lawn, looking up and down the silent length of Cimarron Street. He was a tall man, 36, born of English-German stock, his features undistinguished except for the long, determined mouth and the bright blue of his eyes, which moved now over the charred ruins of the houses on each side of his. He'd burned them down to prevent them from jumping on his roof from the adjacent ones. After a few minutes, he took a long, slow breath and went back into the house. He tossed the hammer on the living room couch, then lit another cigarette and had his mid-morning drink. Later, he forced himself into the kitchen to grind up the 5-day accumulation of garbage in the sink. He knew he should burn up the paper plates and utensils, too, and dust the furniture and wash out the sinks and the bathtub and toilet, and change the sheets and pillowcase on his bed, but he didn't feel like it. For he was a man, and he was alone, and these things had no importance to him. It was almost noon. Robert Neville was in his hothouse collecting a basketful of garlic. In the beginning, it had made him sick to smell garlic in such quantity. His stomach had been in a state of constant turmoil. Now the smell was in his house and in his clothes, and sometimes he thought it was even in his flesh. He hardly noticed it at all. When he had enough bulbs, he went back to the house and dumped them on the drain board of the sink. As he flicked the wall switch, the light flickered, then flared into normal brilliance. A disgusted hiss passed his clenched teeth. The generator was at it again. He'd have to get out that damned manual again and check the wiring. And if it were too much trouble to repair, he'd have to install a new generator.